On her first day at Fort Colson, Lieutenant Rachel Harlan stood ramrod straight in formation, the sharp autumn wind tugging at her uniform, heart pounding beneath the badge stitched over her left breast, a badge unfamiliar to most, one she had sewn herself because no official one existed, not in this country, not anymore. And as the command group strode past in review, her presence, her patch, her silence, drew uneasy glances from fellow soldiers until the inspecting officer, a silver-haired four-star general named Boyd T. Ellison, paused mid-stride, eyes narrowing on the insignia that didn't match regulation, and with the weight of rank behind him. He barked, "Lieutenant, what the hell is that on your chest?" And pointing with sharp disdain while the platoon stiffened around her. Some snickering quietly, others averting their eyes. And Rachel, jaw tight, voice steady, replied, "It's a tribute." "Sir." But Ellison wasn't interested in explanations. Not when appearances mattered more than truth in front of the media team filming for Armed Forces Day. And he stepped closer, voice rising, "You call this trash a badge? You dishonor the uniform with made-up decorations?" And with that he plucked at the edge of the patch like he might rip it clean off, but froze when he saw her eyes, steady burning, not with fear but memory. And something about the shape of that hand-stitched symbol began to itch at the back of his mind. Something he couldn't place but felt he should have known, because it wasn't just thread and fabric. It was a story sewn in pain and pride, and someone behind him muttered, "That's not a U.S. insignia." And Ellison turned sharply, demanding, "Whose is it then?" To which Rachel answered evenly, "My husband's." "Sir, Sergeant Davy Harland of the 3rd United Coalition KIA, Sector 19, 2043. And the name hit like a low explosion in the minds of the few old officers who remembered the off-book missions in the Joint Command years. Missions that had no parades, no medals, no survivors, and only grief-stained silence. And Ellison stared, something flickering in his hard-set face. But before he could respond, a younger officer scoffed from the side, "There's no record of a Sergeant Harland in our system." And Rachel's eyes flared as she stepped forward, fire in her voice. Of course not. They erased him when the mission went wrong, when the politics turned, when our allies died under friendly fire and no one wanted to answer for it. And for the first time the formation broke its stillness, heads turning, whispers rising, cameras still rolling, and the air thickened with discomfort as Rachel continued, her voice cracking but never faltering. He died saving 30 men from 3 countries, all buried under the same desert. But his body was left behind because someone signed a paper saying extraction wasn't worth it. And Ellison looked like granite, unmoving. But the wrinkle near his temple deepened as she reached into her blouse pocket and pulled out a folded, faded photograph, not for him, but for the camera crew who instinctively zoomed in. And in it, a bearded soldier knelt beside a burning Humvee, one arm around a bleeding comrade, his chest bearing the very same insignia now stitched on her breast. And she held it high, her voice rising, "You may not recognize this badge, but I do. I held it in my hands when they gave me his last effects in a cardboard box, and I wear it not for permission, but because I promised him I would never let them forget." And silence swept across the hangar like a wave, no longer the silence of discipline, but the hush of reckoning, and someone near the rear, a tech sergeant with haunted eyes, stepped forward unbidden and said, "I was there. Sector 19, I remember that patch." And another voice followed, and then another. As if her truth cracked open the sealed vault of memory the military had tried to bury. And suddenly this wasn't about a badge anymore. It was about all the soldiers whose stories had been swallowed by politics, whose sacrifices were marked classified, whose names never made it to the wall. And Ellison stood in the center of it all. No longer the unquestioned authority, but a man surrounded by truths he could not command away. And Rachel, breathing hard now, stared him down not in defiance but in grief. Because all she ever wanted was for someone to see that symbol and ask why it mattered. And as the general lowered his hand, a tremor passed through him. Recognition dawning not just of the badge, but of his own role in the system that silenced such stories, and to the stunned shock of all present, he stepped back, snapped to attention, and saluted, not out of pressure or shame, but because for the first time in decades, he remembered what respect truly meant, and that gesture, that single salute, shattered the tension like glass. The camera shutters clicked wildly, the formation stood a little straighter, and the younger officer who had mocked her stared at the floor, chastened as Ellison spoke again. Voice lower now, hoarser. "Lieutenant Harland, I apologize, not just for this morning, but for everything that buried your husband's name," and she nodded once. Blinking fast, and he turned to his aide, voice firm again, but this time directed not against her but toward justice. "Get me the file on the third UC. I don't care how deep it's buried." And over the next few weeks, the base's public affairs team released a statement acknowledging the forgotten coalition. Memorial plaques were commissioned, and a special ceremony was arranged at Arlington's East Annex, not just for Sergeant Harland, but for all whose service had vanished under policy and red tape. And Rachel stood at the podium that day, wearing the same patch on her breast, no longer questioned, no longer alone, as beside her stood General Ellison, not in command but in support, and he handed her a box, small, velvet-lined, containing an official commendation, forged not from old orders but newly signed recognition. And as the flag behind them waved in the breeze, and a 21-gun salute rang out over the hills, Rachel's hand closed over that box and she whispered, "You kept your promise, Davy. Now I've kept mine, and somewhere in the back, the same camera crew from that humiliating inspection day captured it all, not for social media, not for likes, but because sometimes the world needs to see what truth looks like when it finally stands tall in uniform, no longer silenced, no longer mocked, no longer hidden behind a badge no one recognized. Until now.